Hello, this is Dr. Clark, and today we're going to be going over veterinary drug use, prescribing, acquisition, and pharmacy management. So we're looking at some of the different names, and so one of the first names we actually come to is a chemical name, and so this is a scientific and technical name actually describing the molecular makeup of the drug. And so in this case, this is 7-chloro-1, 3-dihydro, 1-methyl, 5-phenyl, 2-H1, 4-benzodiazepine, 2,1 is the chemical name of this drug. If you were to call this out to a chemist or a pharmacist, that could actually draw this whole drawing right here for you right away. And this is going to be listed for every drug on there as what the chemical name of the drug is. There's also the generic name, which is a non-proprietary name. So this does not actually have any type of trademark or patent to it with a generic name. All drugs have an official generic name, and the names are actually assigned by the U.S. Adopted Names Council, which is a part of the pharmaceutical companies, that you actually submit a name for the drug, and then they look through, see if there's one that actually matches the already in use. If it is, then it gets kicked back to you. When they're actually naming these and you're naming them, you're supposed to be describing the active drug itself. And these are going to be written in lowercase, so a lot of times, like if you see Pam at the end, a lot of these are going to be, or AM, a lot of these are going to be in the same category, and they're going to have a lot of the same uses. And so in this case, it's diazepam, which is actually this first drug here is also diazepam. So the chemical name is this. The generic name is diazepam. And it's always written in lowercase when we're writing generic. Brand name or trade name is a proprietary name, so there's actually a legal patented right to the use of this name. And this name is proprietary and can only be used by that company that holds the patent on it. And so these are always going to be written with a capital. So in this case, diazepam's trade name is Valium, capital V, and then it should always have this R with a circle at the end, which means it's a registered patent right. If you're using a generic and it's not the actual label Valium, then you have to call it by the generic name diazepam. So you can't call a generic Valium. You can only use Valium for that actual trade brand name. And there's many different generic forms of diazepam, and so you can use those trade names on those generics and use them fine, but you can only use Valium on that product that's labeled as Valium. One of the generics might be, let's say it's called, diazoxidate. And so you could use diazoxidate specifically for that one that has that as a label name on it. Or brand name on it. So the brand name can only go if you're using that actual brand of the drug. Otherwise, you have to use the generic name. So going on forward, one of the things that we end up doing is compounding in veterinary medicine. And so compounding is actually preparing, mixing, assembling, packaging, or labeling a drug based on a prescription order from a licensed veterinarian. And there's several different needs when we're doing compounding that we're trying to fill. And there's limitations on compounding. We just can't compound any drug that we want to. And so we're having to fill a specific need when we're having to go and do compounding. One of the main things is there's not an approved drug available, or if there is an approved drug, maybe it's in a strength or a flavor that we need to change, and so we're compounding to change it. So some different reasons for compounding is using discontinued drugs that are still effective. So there's certain drugs that we can get in the raw powder form that are no longer on the market, and we can compound those. We can actually, and this is more common to do, is creating dosages and strengths that are specific to a dog's weight and health, or horses or cows or whatever it is. So we're going for something that's actually in a dosage and strength that's actually going to make it easier to give to that animal. So it might be like something like ibuprofen. I think you have to give like 20 tablets to a horse for an effective dose. Well, we can actually compound ibuprofen for horses and turn it into a liquid and make it to where you just have to give 2 milliliters. That's another thing right here, is we can actually change the form from, say, a tablet to a liquid, or to a topical ointment, to a chewable tablet. Add flavoring, so there's a lot of things that cats don't like that we can actually sit there and flavor them up and make them tuna flavored. It becomes a lot more appealing, a lot easier to give it to that animal. And then custom formulations, where we're actually combining multiple drugs to make it to where it's easier to give it in one administration. Some concerns about it is that compounding might actually change an FDA-approved drug into an unapproved drug. This usually is more in food animals if we change routes or something. They're very strict on what we can do in food animals. In the state of Texas, the compounded drug, it actually has to be FDA approved for us to legally give it in Texas, and I'll have a separate video on what some of the laws are for Texas. Compounded drugs are made without FDA oversight, so you don't actually have an inspector there watching exactly what's going on when they're compounding the drugs. If you go to a factory where they're being made, there's an FDA inspector. They're actually checking so many of them, 1 out of every 10 packages or tablets or whatever. It's checked for purity and strength. You don't have this with compounding pharmacies. Sometimes, if they don't do things right, the drug might not be sterile if it's being given in an injection, so they're supposed to use these sterile rooms to do it. If they have any breakdown in sterility, then there's a very good chance that if you give something intravenous to your patient or IM, you can cause an infection. So it's very important to know where the compounding is taking place, how they're doing it, to make sure that this is not going to be a problem. And errors in preparing the drug, so getting your decimal points off. There was a case, probably about 10 or 15 years ago that really brought compounding to light in Florida, where they were making this drug that was approved in Argentina that was not approved in the United States. They were having it compounded here to give to a bunch of polo horses. One of the main ingredients was selenium, and they had their decimal place off by 1, and they overdosed the horses on selenium, and 22 polo horses died. We've also had a problem up here of infections with the New England compounding pharmacy was making for the human side something that was actually available to the human side, but they were doing it at a cheaper cost. And their sterile room was not sterile, and over 30 patients ended up getting fungal meningitis from this preparation to be given epidurally in people. If we're looking for information on drugs, we go to something called the United States Pharmacopoeia, the USP. So publication legally recognized as the drug standard in the U.S. It's done by the pharmaceutical companies, and it's accepted by the FDA. And so it describes the source, appearance, properties, standards of purities, and all the other requirements of a pure drug. And the FDA requires that all drugs meet the USP standards. And so said USP is one of these things. It's run by the industry, but it's overseen by the FDA. So the FDA approves what those standards are going to be, and then all the drugs have to meet that USP standard, and the FDA holds up that USP standard. Going forward, when we're actually looking at drug labels, there's certain things on the outside of all drugs that has to be there. First is drug name. Both generic and trade name has to be there. Concentration and quantity, so how many mg per tablet it is, how many tablets are in there. Name and address of manufacturer. Manufacturer's control or lot number, expiration date, withdrawal time if it's for food animals, and controlled substance status on the outside. Over-the-counter drugs also have to have this same basic information minus the controlled substance, because there's no controlled substances available over the counter, but every drug on the outside of it has to have this minimum information on the outside. Additionally, there's package inserts, and so the package insert will have a lot of that same information on the outside. It's going to have the trade name, the generic name, the chemical name, controlled substance notations on their description or composition statement, clinical pharmacology and actions or modes of actions, indications and usage, so indications when we're going to use it, and how do we use it with our usage. Is it going to be once a day, twice a day, IV, IM, oral. Contraindications. Contra means when not to, so when not to use it. Precautions about the drug, so what to mix it with, what not to mix it with. Warnings. So warnings would be things that, obvious signs when things are going wrong, what to do, or not to use it in things like pregnant animals because it might actually cause things like birth defects. So all of these different things can be warnings. Precautions would be like, use with caution when mixing with certain other drugs, or, it's not been established full efficacy, full safety in breeding animals. And then after your precautions and warnings, you have to have adverse reactions or side effects. And every drug is going to have an adverse reaction and side effect. One of the main one is known drug allergies. So one of the main things that you're always going to see there is any known allergies. Overdose information, so what to do if you do too much. Back to dosage administration. So how many mgs per mil and how we're going to give it, how to store it properly, and how it's supplied to you. Is it in tablet? Is it in liquid forms? How many milligrams per tablet? How many milligrams per milliliter? All that's going to be on your package insert. We have some references, and so some of the major references that we end up using are things like the Physician's Desk Reference, PDR, that's for human approved drug. In the veterinary side, we use the Veterinary Pharmaceuticals and Biologicals, or the VPB, or the Compendium of Veterinary Products, the CVP. And actually, you can get the CVP through the App Store for Apple and Androids for free. You can actually get the CVP on your phone. You can get the PDR also for your phone or tablets. The main thing with those is that when you look at getting a PDR, is you're going to have to pay for that. So the CVP is free. PDR you're going to have to pay for. I'm not sure if there's a form of the veterinary or the VPB, the Veterinary Pharmaceuticals and Biologicals, available through the App Store or not. Expiration dates. So all drugs and medical appliances are supposed to have expiration dates, or sterile medical appliances. And so these are assigned to drugs, and there's kind of a basic mixture. And it's not really scientific how they've done this, and all the drug companies follow this basic guideline, but biologicals are usually 2 years. Injections are of other things such as corticosteroids or anesthetics or something like that can be up to 3 or 4 years. Tablets can be up to as long as 3 or 4 years. Things like sterile surgical instruments and stuff that are wrapped, those can actually be up to 6 years. And so they have these maximum lengths for expiration dates, and then it's up to the manufacturer to decide how long they want to put. Sometimes they assign these based on information that they have. A lot of times these are just arbitrary. And so a lot of these laws about expiration dates were actually made in the 1960s. They were kind of arbitrarily set, and we still have used that arbitrary setting today. We've actually done testing and found out a lot of the drugs are actually good and stable when they're stored according to label for 10 to 15 years. Now, I'm not advocating using an expired drug, just saying that they're actually probably stable a lot longer than what we think, but we're using a system, and it's best to follow that system on expiration dates, because there's some drugs that we know for sure, like tetracyclines, that usually after about 3 or 4 years, they actually start to break down and they turn into things that are very toxic to the liver. So it's important to follow them, but just be aware that sometimes if a drug goes on to back order, we are able to use it for, say, 6 months afterwards until we can get a new shipment in. And those drugs will actually a lot of times still be good for that 6-month period. If we don't have a reason like that, then we just have to dispose and get rid of those drugs. Dispensing versus prescribing. So dispensing is actually when we're going to fill a prescription in-house, and this is something unique to veterinary medicine. It doesn't really happen in human medicine, and part of the reason for this is that pharmacies have really focused on human drugs and not over on animal drugs. So a lot of times when we want to sit there and prescribe something for a pharmacy to go fill, they don't actually have a lot of our veterinary drugs. A lot of times they will fill it in the human form for certain drugs. So like Bactrim, we have trimethoprim sulfa tablets or Bactrim for animals. And then we can also get Bactrim filled on the human side through the pharmacies. So they will have some of our drugs over there, but they've not really gotten into the veterinary market, which means in that case that we end up having to actually fill the prescriptions in-house and dispensing. One thing to know about dispensing is I can dispense out of my own hospital, but you might walk into my hospital with a prescription from another vet. I can't dispense for another vet out of another clinic. I can only dispense for myself, because if I dispense for somebody else and fill somebody else's prescription, then I become a pharmacy. One thing that's really taken off on the veterinary side has been online pharmacies for veterinary products such as PetMeds and Foster's and Smith's. And so those are things that a lot of times veterinarians for certain drugs that they don't want to carry will call in prescriptions to those locations. When we're looking at drugs, prescribing and dispensing, veterinary drugs are only approved for use in animals. Human drugs are approved only for use in people. However, we can use either one extra label. We've gone over the extra label laws. One thing to know is that human drugs, a lot of times, especially like antibiotics and stuff, we're not allowed to actually use those extra label over in food animals. And there is actually a regulation you can go to, which is compliance policy guide, which will actually tell you whether or not you can use those drugs, or once again back to FARAD, FARAD, the Food Animal Residue Avoidance Data Bank will have a lot of that information. Whether I'm dispensing or prescribing, I have to establish a valid veterinary client-patient relationship, or a VCPR. Has to be in place. That means I have to have agree to take somebody on as a client, agree to take their animal on as a patient, and I've had to see them within the last year. And if I have, then I'm able to sit there and do a prescription for that animal or dispense medication for that animal. I can either write out a prescription for them to have filled, I can call it in to a pharmacy, or I can write it in the medical record. And if I write it in the medical record for a prescription, then they can come in and you can refill it at any time. I don't have to be there. As long as it's in there, then you can actually refill it. If I don't have a VCPR, or that prescription is not written in the record someplace, then it cannot be filled. So the veterinary client-patient relationship is required for all prescription drugs, and so this actually has to exist. And so the things have to be met that I just talked about. The veterinarian has to assume responsibility for making clinical judgment. The client has to agree to follow. There has to be sufficient knowledge of the animal to make a preliminary diagnosis for the drugs. And also, you can also do things for individual animals. When we get to food animals, you can also do herds and flocks. But once again, I have to see it and have knowledge of that to be able to do a prescription for that. I have to be readily available for follow-up and have some type of plan in place in case there's an adverse reaction or failure of treatment. So I have to have some way, if there's an emergency, they can get in touch with me or have them referred to another clinic. So I have to have all these things in place. I have to make sure that the drugs are properly labeled before they're dispensed, if we're dispensing them and filling them in-house, and that dispensing and treatment records have to be maintained, and that the drugs should be dispensed in quantities required to treat the animal. So if it takes 30 tablets, we just dispense 30 tablets. We don't dispense 40 just in case. So we're going to dispense the amount that's actually going to be needed. So a prescription is a written order that a pharmacist can fill. And so all prescriptions have to have the following things on them. There has to be the name of the clinic or the name of the veterinarian. So this is Smart Veterinary Hospital, Dr. Joyce Smart. There has to be a phone number. There has to be an address. Here they're using a P.O. box. In Texas, I have to have a physical address with this also. I have to have the owner's name, the animal's name, the species, and the address of the owner. I have to have the name of the drug, the strength, the quantity. I have to have instructions, which is called SIG for use of patient. I have to have the number of refills. I have to have the date that the prescription is filled out, along with age of the animal. And finally, I have to have the signature of the veterinarian here. So this could be John Smith with his dog Fido Smith, K9, address 123 ABC Street, Waco, Texas 76708. Name of drug would be something like prednisone, 20 milligrams, number 30, and then instructions would be like 3 tablets twice a day for 3 days, followed with 3 tablets once a day for 3 days, followed by a half a tablet once a day for 3 days, followed by a quarter of a tablet once a day for 3 days, like that. Over here, I'd have to have the date, so something like, January the 2nd, 2017, age of the animal, 10-year-old, number of refills, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or PRN, per required need. Then I have to have my signature here. A lot of times we'll also have our DEA numbers on these things and our state license number. So when we dispense, there's going to be the name and address of the veterinarian on there, phone number. A lot of times we'll add our license number on there. The client's name, if it's a controlled substance in Texas, you also have to put their address. Has to be physical address, not a post office box. Animal's name and species, so Fido, K9, or I guess it could be Fido Cat. Drug name and strength and quantity, so prednisone, 25 milligrams, quantity 15 tablets. Date of that it's filled, so once again January the 2nd, 2016. Directions for use, so 5 tablets once a day for 3 days or something along that order, and then 1 tablet a day for 15 days, whatever that order is going to be. And then refill information, you can put that on the label, and you can also write that in in the record. And so 0 refills, PRN, whatever that needs to be on the outside. So here's a prescription label, Smart Hospital, Dr. J. Smart. So whoever the veterinarian is, if you're in a multi-veterinary practice, you have to put whoever the veterinarian is. Here, there's just me. But if there was another veterinarian there, then we have to put in the name of who the veterinarian is prescribing. Address, once again in Texas, it has to be the physical. You can include the mailing too, but you have to have the physical. The animal's name, here in Texas, we require address only if it's a controlled substance. Name of the animal, Silver Ross Barnes here. Species is a horse. The date is dispensed, July 13th, 2016, let's say. Directions, apply 4 drops daily, both eyes. Name of the veterinarian, once again, that's having this medication. Ordering it to be dispensed. 0 refills. And this is the name of the drug, Genocin ophthalmic drops, 3 milligrams per milliliter. Total of 5 milliliters. And so all this information has to be in there, maybe not in this exact order, but it has to be somewhere close. Sometimes what you'll actually see is your drug up here and your directions are down below. Refill, and sometimes the veterinarian's down here. All your labels are going to have to say this: for veterinary use only, and keep out of children's reach. There's other labels and warnings, precautions you might put on there besides that, but these two are always there. It's either going to say for animal use only or for veterinary use only, and all of them are going to say, anytime you dispense something, keep out of children's reach or reach of children. So prescription drugs can be dispensed by pharmacists or trained veterinary staff. When we're dispensing, everything has to be labeled properly like we just went over. And staff members cannot refill or dispense medication without veterinary approval. That could be actually having it on the outside of the bottle. Client brings it back in. The refills are there. Most of the time it's going to be written in the record how many refills we're willing to do and whether or not we have to see that animal again. It has to be in a child-proof container, and if it's not in a child-proof container, we have to tell them that it's not in a child-proof container. We do this sometimes. We have elder clients. They're not able to open up a child-proof container, so we will put them in a container that can be swapped from child-proof to non-child-proof. But you have to let them know, and you have to make sure that they know, keep it out of reach of any small children. But if it's not a reason like that, then we're always going to sit there and make sure it's in a child-proof container. And then any type of cautionary statements, like I said, veterinary use only, keep out of reach of children, those are going to be on there. We can keep record keeping here on medications, either on paper or an electronic record. A lot of times now, a lot of our systems will do a very good job keeping up with them electronically, keeping up with refills, reminding clients when to come in for refills. So we do a lot of these things electronically. You do still have some places that also will do it by the paper, but it saves a lot of money, and it's actually made practice a lot more efficient by going paperless and letting the electronic systems do it. So improved efficiency, no loss of records, immediate access to records, and ability to pull up all prescriptions on one scene, some advantages, especially when you're using cloud-based systems. I'm not going to say no loss of records if you're not, because you could lose your hard drive. But if you're using a cloud-based system, then you have a backup locally, and then you have someplace else you can always keep it at. Definitely saves on space, not having to have tons and tons of file cabinets and boxes every place. And then less filing time, and then retrieval is so much easier. So there's a lot of advantages to going to electronic. We can avoid errors by prompting animals that have allergic reactions. It can actually look for drug interactions. And then it can identify clients with special considerations. Once again, that elderly person that might have trouble opening a regular child-proof bottle, you might need to know to swap that top around to where it's easier for them to open it up. And then it can actually put in other things such as laboratory data and prescription instructions can be put in the computers in advance, and they can actually be filled out in advance. So you can have a standard prescription for a drug for a certain weight range on an animal already done, and all you have to do is just click on that one, how many tablets, and it'll automatically fill out and populate the information for you. In your book, you do have on page 106 a whole bunch of abbreviations that are approved, and so I would suggest looking at that. When we're looking at veterinary economics, it's important to realize that keeping a supply of drugs or a pharmacy is a business, and that you're trying to make money off of that. So there's a lot of things that you have to take in consideration when running a pharmacy. One thing to know is nowadays our supply chain is so efficient, and a lot of times our distribution centers are close enough to where we don't have to keep huge supplies of drugs on shelves. 30, 40 years ago, we used to have a distributor. They might have been in New York. It might have taken you a week to get your medication, so we always had to keep a large supply on hand. Of course, back then, a lot of times to fill things up, we could call in, but a lot of times we were having to mail stuff in. Now we can do it with a few keystrokes of a computer, and we can get most things the next day. And so some things that we know we can't get the next day, we might keep a little bit higher in stock. But if we can get it the next day, then a lot of times we keep our inventory a lot more lean. And for us, it's a lot better that way because when you're buying a drug, it's like making an investment. And there's an actual cost to this. There's the cost for you having to put it on the shelf and then trying to keep up with it. And then the longer it sits there, we look at that money and we look at, well, if you had put it in the investment market, and something like a CD, how much money would it have accumulated off of interest? And so if you have a drug that sits there for a year, if you put that money somewhere else, you could have made a lot more money out of it. Or you could have put it in another drug and made a lot more money out of it. But right now it's tied up on your shelf. So it's important to look at your pharmacy management to understand what things are moving fast, what are moving slow, trying to keep your quantities right, trying to keep enough of everything that moves fast. If there's something that doesn't move that well, maybe we only keep one bottle of it. Or maybe we don't keep it at all, and maybe we do a prescription to a mail order pharmacy. Or we just order it and have it overnight it whenever we need it. In some locations, you might be close enough that you can send somebody over and charge a courier fee to actually go pick it up at the distribution centers. So like I'm in Fort Worth, there's several of them for different drug companies here in Texas in Fort Worth. Some clinics around Fort Worth, they can actually drive over there and just pick them up the same day. So inventory and control maintenance. So, you got to look at the time invested in trying to maintain your stocks and the overall business health from having to do that of your veterinary practice. So there's going to be time involved with you ordering the drug, getting the drug in, putting it up on the shelf, and then maintaining it on the shelf. And so trying to make that as efficient as possible is very important for overall efficiency and profitability of the practice. I'll see a lot of people spend 3 hours trying to chase 3 pennies worth of savings and spend $30 in man hours doing that, or $40, and it's not worth it. So, understanding that most of the time your distributors, there's not much more than a 10% difference in price. Finding out which ones that you want to deal with and which ones usually have the better prices on the products. And a lot of times you can actually do this fairly quickly online and figure out which one you want to go to. Figuring out what quantities you need to have, what your low amount is. So it might be one of those things that when you get down to the last 3 of something, you order more of it. Or you might just keep one on the shelf when you sell it. You might just order another one then if it's a slow mover. And a lot of times we can use computers to actually keep up with this. So it's very important if you're using a computer system to always enter anything that's been dispensed or sold, because as it's coming off of the shelf, it's already automatically marketing it and saying, okay, I had 6, now I have 5. When I get down to 3, the computer is going to send an alert. And sometimes they even will have them to where they automatically do the ordering back to the distributor for you, or sometimes they will alert you and you go ahead and call the distributor. Remember, the longer it sits on the shelf, the longer it's going to cost that practice. There's a lot of hidden costs involved. And too much inventory ties up money that could go into equipment to expand what your practice is able to do, or into other pharmaceuticals that move a lot better, or potentially into your bonuses and your raises. When we look at inventory purchasing, there's going to be things like direct marketing. So this is when a drug is purchased directly from the company that manufactures it. Supposedly there's a cost savings by doing this. I think a lot of times the companies mark it up to what it would be through a distributor, but they claim it's cheaper to do it, and maybe it is. But there's several different companies that do direct marketing. A lot of things we go through distributors. They're called also wholesalers, but distributors more like it. And so they're actually purchasing the drugs from various drug companies, and it's like a big Walmart. It's one-stop shopping. You can get everything that you need. They purchase it and then they resell it to us in the veterinary market. We can also buy certain drugs from other practices. We can't prescribe or dispense from one another, But if one practice has a drug and I'm out of it, I can actually go and buy that drug as long as it's not a controlled substance from that other practice. You also have co-ops of veterinary practices that go in together and buy things. And then we can actually go directly to pharmacies, write prescriptions, get drugs in and bring them back in. So there's other sources and groups for actually bringing in inventory. So managing it's trying to keep stock appropriate but not having it overly stocked. Also organizing items to where they're easy to locate. Some places will do this alphabetically. Some will do it by category of drugs. They'll put all the antibiotics together, they'll put all the NSAIDs together, they'll put all the anesthetic agents together. Whenever you receive something, it's sitting there and inspecting it right away, making sure that if it was cold, shipped cold, that it's still cold, making sure none of the bottles are broken, tops have come off, anything's leaked out, making sure that it's the right size and everything. So it's actually going over those inventory sheets that come with it, those invoice sheets, and making sure that all that information is correct. And then rotating stock and monitoring expiration dates. So you always want to move your shortest expiration date to the front. Usually that's your older drugs, not always, but most of the time it is. So shortest date moves to the front, and then your longer dates, expiration dates, move to the back. And then we constantly sit there and manage and rotate that stock to where we move the stuff that is the shortest date out. We also have to watch when we order stuff. If we get a bunch of short dated stuff in, we might want to consider returning it back or even asking if there's a deal. They're wanting to sell us something 50% off. Always ask, well, what is the expiration date on that? Because you might find out it's only short dated. You might not want as much of it. I found in my practice there's some things I could buy short dated, like phenylbutazone. I could sell a lot of phenylbutazone to horses. I didn't care. You could have a 1 month date. I could get rid of it. I had other drugs that I wasn't able to do that as much with that were specialized. So if I was trying to buy things like Banamine paste didn't sell as easily, I had to watch the date. So if I bought a case of 10 of those, I would want to make sure that they were good for at least 6 months. Vaccines I had to watch out with too. So, you have to watch those dates. If they're going to be too short, or if you have a problem with a company selling you short dated stuff, find out ahead of time what the date is. And then trying to rotate and make sure that you're getting rid of the short dated stuff first. Because once it expires and you get rid of it, then you're going to have to sit there and throw it out in the garbage once it goes out of date. And that's no different than you walking out there with money from the practice and throwing it in the garbage. And so that's going to affect the profitability of the practice. And then the bottom, and at the end of the day, the bottom line for you, and whether or not, you lose too much, you might lose your job because the practice gets into really bad financial trouble. Or that could be, buying some of the equipment that you want, or production bonuses at the end of the year. So you have to keep that in mind and trying to keep those dates in check, because if you have to throw something away, that's becomes very costly to you. So that is Chapter 5.